Hi, I'm Kevin Douglas from Simon Fraser University, professor in the Department of Psychology, also threat assessment specialist at Protect International Risk and Safety Services. So I want to give you a nutshell of my talk on mental disorder and violence, the relevance of mental disorder to violent behavior. It's a controversial topic. There's been a lot of disagreement in the field over decades. Some people would argue that mental disorder is actually not terribly important in terms of thinking about violence risk, whereas others would argue that it certainly is important. Part of the reason for this disagreement is, I think, over-reliance on one or two studies that either show very strong support or not much support. So for that reason, along with my colleagues Stephen Hart and Laura Guy, we conducted what's called a meta-analysis, or a summary of actually over 200 studies, and we found a modest but meaningful association between mental disorder and violence. In particular, we were focusing on major mental disorders like schizophrenia and other psychotic related disorders and disorders involving mania, with about a 70% increase in the odds of violence for those who had those mental disorders. But it depended. So there were actually some studies that found an inverse association, some that found a very strong association. So we found that when mental disorder is occurring in the community, somebody's living in the community, and the comparison group is other people living in the community and they don't have mental disorders themselves, then we see a stronger association. You see a stronger association when the focus is on what we'd call acute positive symptoms of mental disorder. For example, hallucinations, that is seeing or hearing things that aren't there. Or delusions, which are fixed false beliefs that are not amenable to change in the face of contradictory evidence, persecutory delusions, paranoid delusions, those sorts of things. And we found that compared to people with what might be called internalizing disorders like anxiety, there was a heightened risk, but compared to people with externalizing disorders such as antisocial personality or psychopathy, that psychosis did not further elevate the risk for violence there. So we want to know, though, why might mental disorder be violent? So when a person with mental disorder commits a violent act, the mental disorder might not have anything to do with the violence. So to try to understand whether it does or not, we need to be looking at how the mental disorder might be influencing somebody's decision-making processes. That is, could it motivate somebody to use violence to accomplish some goal? For example, it's pretty common for people with certain types of psychotic symptoms to fear that others might be trying to hurt them. So persecutory delusions, paranoid delusions. And so a person may be motivated to act out against others to try to protect themselves. In other cases, people with mental disorder may have a great fear, and so part of the use of violence could be to express frustration or anger, or to try to control or change their situation. Now, mental disorder could also influence people's decisions by disinhibiting them. So when somebody is symptomatic, they may experience things such as lower insight into the impact of their behaviors or less empathy than they might otherwise have, and that reduces the perceived cost to them of acting in a violent way. So that's a disinhibitor. And finally, mental disorder could destabilize a person's problem-solving abilities. So the ability to think clearly through situations to generate solutions that are not violent. Because major mental disorder, especially during active phases, can have quite serious impacts on a person's cognitive abilities and the ability to conduct kind of a sound, logical problem-solving approach. So the other thing that I want to talk about is, despite the fact that in my view there is some link on average between major mental disorder and violence, not all people with mental disorder act violently, and indeed people with major mental disorder are more likely to take their own lives through suicide, because major mental disorder can have a very devastating impact on people and on their ability to take care of themselves. And people with major mental disorder are also more likely to be the victims of violence than they are to perpetrate violence. Despite that, when major mental disorder is present, it's vitally important in a threat assessment or risk assessment context to understand its potential relevance for that person's risk of perpetrating violence against others. Thank you.